Today is July 28th, 2022. I am Cameron Wood here with Alvin Taylor at A Place for Us in Cleveland, Ohio. We're going to talk about the gay community in Cleveland today. Mr. Taylor, can you please say and spell your name for me?
My name is Alvin Taylor, ALVIN TAYLOR.
Thank you. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Sanford, Florida in 1952.
How did you end up coming to Ohio?
After I finished college, I was just floating around and saw an ad for ballroom dancing training. So I started training in Florida as a ballroom dancer. And then a lady came through from another studio here and they said that they had an opening and would I be interested in moving to Cleveland? And since I wasn't doing anything, I said, sure. Packed up my bags, moved to Cleveland.
How old were you when you moved to Cleveland?
See, just after college, around 25 maybe. Hated it.
You didn't like Cleveland when you first moved here?
No, not at all.
What was your home like in Florida?
Well, for one thing, I grew up in basically a brothel. This is where there were people who stayed there long term, but there were also people who rented rooms by the hour. And it was an odd little upbringing because there were so many contradictions. For example, the bad ladies, they would sneak up the front steps, and all the deacons and the teachers and the muckety mucks, they would sneak up the back. And my job was to show them to their rooms, to take their money, and then knock on the door after 1 hour. So naturally, I peeped through the keyhole. So for the longest time, I thought sex was about the stupidest thing I'd ever seen in my life. It was a pretty good childhood. It was just me and my mother. So all things considered, it was a pretty happy childhood. There were all sorts of weird occurrences, but when you're going through them, you don't really think they're that odd. It's not until you look back and think about them or talk to other people about them that you really think how bizarre it was in actuality. The advantage, though, is that it learned me how to deal with contradictions, which I think kept me sane, because a lot of people go a little bit nuts when they can't reconcile things that are so opposite.
What kind of weird experiences did you have?
Growing up,
Yeah.
my mother had I had a lot of uncles, so that was it. They weren't really weird outside of just living in that boarding house. That was about the weirdest thing of all. Other than that, nothing that falls under weird too much. I knew that I had complete control and with my mother's friends because they had to go through me, of course. So, and I was an only child too. So that factors into the equation for sure. Most of my weird experiences were in colleges, more than anything else. I didn't know that I was poor until I got to college because everybody in the community was sort of on the same plane and nobody made a big difference about it, really, until I got out of that community.
Where did you go to college?
It was called Florida Presbyterian at the time, but it changed its name to Eckerd College because he gave big bucks in St. Petersburg, Florida.
What did you study in college?
I started out with a double major in psychology and sociology. And after that, I went into banking for a couple of years. I dealt with the Department of Rehabilitation for a couple of years. And none of those really stuck. And it's a case where I should have done what I've been doing all the time. So I ended up teaching English literature, and I did a lot of reading, but because I did it, I didn't really think of it as a profession as such. It was just something that I did.
And then had you been dancing prior to this? Because then you went into dancing,
Then
right?
I moved out here and I danced for seven. I taught ballroom for 7 years, and I decided that I couldn't do that long term, just physically after a while. And then I decided to go back to school. So I went to Cleveland State, and I got a master's in education and a master's in English, which helped out a lot when it came to getting a job, by the way.
And what did you? So you did ballroom dancing for 7 years. What did you do after ballroom dancing?
After ballroom dancing, I did retail, and then I worked at an adult bookstore, and that's where I learned about the ways of the wicked world. Because coming from the South, I was fairly naive about a lot of things, but that job, which in addition paid off my student loan, by the way, um, I was meeting all sorts of people that I had never met before, because it was at a time there was a lesbian bar here, there was a gay bar here, and usually I worked third shift. And there's nothing more interesting in dealing with a lot of drunk, horny people at 2 a.m. So it was an education.
Well, let's jump back just a second to when you first came up to Cleveland. Um, you said you didn't like it. What was the reason you didn't like Cleveland at the time?
Um, Two things. One, I didn't know anybody. Two, they'd gotten me an apartment in a part of town that was a little bit odd, kind of, you know. I had to take 3 buses to get to work. I didn't know how I was going to get home because the buses didn't run, so I had to ask for rides. Um, the apartment was about the size of a little bathroom, and when you're coming in new, you're the outsider. On top of which, ballroom dancing is kind of glamorous in a way, and I felt like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz when I first walked in, because I'm coming from the South and I feel like a Beverly Hillbilly, and you walk into this place where people who look fantastic are just floating around, and then there was me, so I felt really out of place. And part of that's just normal, but after a certain while, I blended in, and then it became fun after that. And now it's like home. It shows those initial years not knowing anybody, living in a place where there's snow, excuse me, where there's snow, and just feeling a little bit out of a place.
Did you notice any big differences between North and South when you first moved here?
I felt it. I felt like down south, I felt a lot more grounded and a lot more authentic. And when I moved up here, I was walking around saying hello to everybody, and they're looking at me like, I'm from outer space. Um, I was mugged like my third month here. Um, and it was just so alien to me and unfamiliar because it was like going into a different state, a different place for all those reasons. People seemed a little bit unfriendly because I was coming from a small town. Um, the weather didn't help. Just the chore of getting to work didn't help. So there's a lot of things that build up. And if I had had the money, I would have gone home right away. But I'm so glad that I didn't because those 7 years, they taught me how to be, confident because you're out dancing in front of people. And since I love music, it was great. So I learned a lot at that job that served me well later on, for sure. So I'm glad I didn't go home right away.
So, uh, have you? What point did you realize or know that you were gay? Um,
I would say maybe around Ooh, I knew for sure in high school, and I think maybe like around sixth grade, because until that, you weren't sure. I had girlfriends, I enjoyed kissing under the porch, and there was so much going on that it didn't really register at that point. Um, the thing that did it for me was when I was in the Boy Scouts, and my Boy Scout leader was, for some reason, was walking me home, and he kissed me, and it threw me for a loop for a couple of days. And I think that's when things started to become a little bit confusing, let's just say. And in high school, I had girlfriends, but I had relations with boys. Same thing in college. Um, some of the best sex I had was in college, by the way. Uh, and it was just that, I think that time period made everybody sort of curious. And just because you had relationships with somebody didn't particularly make them gay at that point. I knew that I was at that point, but I didn't normally, I didn't assume that anybody else would just because they had relationships with a guy. It was just a sign of the times, in a way. Plus, it was a very liberal college.
Was there was there a gay community in the South? Did you find a home or a place where you could talk to other people about things, or
Not really. There were people who were gay, and there was a small clique of people who you would consider progressive in a sense. Um, and they had these small little enclaves of people. You know, you knew the cool place to hang out if you were gay, because you'd be accepted. And luckily, I had a very good friend and mentor that helped guide me through a lot of the bumps that could have come. So for me, it wasn't that traumatic growing up, and it was just not something you talked about a lot. Um, so I navigated those pretty well, coupled with the fact that I went to an integrated school in the South just after Jim Crow. So there were so many other things to think about, you know, like not getting beat up after school, that the gay thing, I sort of pushed that down because that was not at the top of my list of things to think about when it came to survival, you know. It was still there in the back of my mind. It just wasn't anything that tormented me. Like I never came out because I never considered myself in. I just wasn't professing it, just living it. But the thing that saved me was just some really good friends and knowing a small circle of people who were into things that were progressive, you know, and that made a big difference. At that time, like that friend, for example, took me to see the boys. I think it was called The Boys in the Band. It was a gay theater production that was turned into a movie, and somehow going to see that helped formulate some ideas in my mind in a good way of what was possible because I didn't really have a prototype on how to be. And plus, being involved in the church and all of that sort of stuff. But it was sort of smooth sailing. There were like bumps in the road every now and then. But other than that, like I wasn't bullied um, as such. But I do remember this time when there were friends who were wondering whether I was gay or not. And in order to prove that I wasn't, I had to have sex with this girl while they all listened at the door. And that is about the weirdest thing I ever had to do in my life. I must say, Oscar worthy. But after that, other than that, that was about the weirdest thing that I had to do now that I think about it. You know, God.
coming to Cleveland then from the South, where you had at least friends who were supportive, and you're disconnected, but you're also coming to Cleveland in a time when the gay and lesbian bar scene is kind of really thriving. Did you find a home in that community or somewhere else?
There was sort of duality. I found a home because, like I said, I worked at a gay bookstore, so there were lots of connections with that in the bars. What threw me for a loop was that some of the bars discriminated because I never quite understood how anybody, as gay people are, that could be repressed or could then turn around and do the same thing. So the concept of a gay redneck was alien to me because I remember going to bars and you had to show lots, like 15 pieces of ID to get in. And I didn't quite understand that concept. Luckily, I had people that worked at the bars, so it was never a real big problem for me because working at the bookstore, you have all sort of connections. But having to go to a bar and be a gay bar and being gay and knowing that you're not necessarily welcome, that sort of threw me for a loop. That was a contradiction I couldn't quite reconcile. The idea of a gay prejudice. But when you think about it, it's not that different than anything else. It's just that people happen to be gay. But that doesn't change what they are otherwise. You know, if you're an idiot, you can be an idiot anywhere. You know,
So what were the reasons why someone at a gay bar who was gay might not be accepted?
race, I think, played a big part of it. That might have played the. I think that might have played the largest part. Because I had to do that. I've had to deal with that in the gay community for a long time. Not overwhelmingly so. When I worked at the bookstore, for example, there was this organization that dealt with gay businesses, and like I was the first black person to join that organization. I had to overcome that. I was the first black person to work at the bookstore, having to overcome that. Um, it was just a weird prejudice. It's like somebody needed somebody to feel better than, so they chose black gay people, I guess. You know, at least that's my theory of it. It just didn't make sense at all. Just kind of goofy. And then a whole lot of it had to do with Freudian kind of stuff. Oh,
So what were the kind of places you worked at a gay book? Can tell me about the gay bookstore that you worked in. What was the name? What was it like?
called West Six News. Had a gay boss, Jewish, and he was used to dealing with a certain kind of gay person, and I didn't fit that mold because I was coming from a different place, where it had already been validated. Um, he did a lot of drugs. He was a little bit nuts, but I really admired him because he was not afraid of anybody. And he taught me how to be like a gay man in terms of standing up for yourself and not putting up with a lot of crap. And I think part of it is because he respected me. Because the other employees there, they really needed the job, so they put up with a lot of things. For example, he would come in and he would just go on these rants. And for example, all the magazines had to be put in plastic. And if everything wasn't just right, he would just go and throw them all off the shelf, just leave them there for the employees to pick up. And the first time he did it to me, I took them and stacked them on his desk and left them. So he thought I was nuts. I was fired twice. once because I was he used to talk to people like I wasn't used to. But the people we were talking to, they were used to yelling back and forth, and I wasn't. And he was talking to this girl once, and he was just being so rude. And I remember saying, if you can't talk to anybody better than that, then you can just go fuck yourself. And he goes, and you're fired. It's like, fired, I can go shopping. But then he hired me back. So it all worked out. And it was a fun job. It was fun. Surprising.
Yeah. What was surprising?
The people who came in and the things they wanted. It was an eye opener because if you can think of it, if you can think of any fetish, there's somebody who's interested in it. You know, amputees, just people who are extremely large, people extremely small, um, little ladies would come in and order these big brown dildos. it was just, it was just odd.
So people you wouldn't expect were doing things that
Exactly,
you would.
exactly. But what it does is open up your world to what's possible. So when it comes to people, you just never know. So I don't really look at people. I look past this because this is just a box that we carry around. You know, it's good to see what's underneath all that, you know. And it makes the world interesting and surprising. So that was good. My two best jobs, ballroom dancing, adult bookstore.
Were a lot of the other people that worked at the adult bookstore, were they also gay or just kind of a mix?
No, as a matter of fact, for a while I might have been the only one there. But then once I got hired, then they started hiring other gay black people to work at the bookstore. So I was like the Rosa Parks of pornography. What I didn't know that you could be arrested for pandering. I didn't know that. Otherwise, I would have thought differently.
Hmm. Did you ever get arrested for that?
No,
No. Oh, was West Sixth News on West Sixth, or was
I
it?
think yes.
Okay.
Ironically, now it's a really, at least it used to be a really upscale restaurant, which I used to just think was the funniest thing in the world.
Can you share your boss's name or
My
the guy who owned the store?
his, his name was Robbie. I don't know the last name.
So, what did you do for fun at that time? You know, you worked at the adult bookstore. What was your off time? What were you interested in? What were you doing?
A lot of dancing. Um, what else? A lot of pot smoking. Just the whole club scene. Um, I always did a lot of reading.
What were the clubs that you'd go to?
Almost all of them. You want names? And one right around from the bookstore was named Numbers. Um, there was a black one in the neighborhood called Petrarca. There was a mixed bar called Chapter 2. There was another mixed bar, a big one. It was called the Garage. There was a one called Etc. Um, there was a place called Mr. Henry's. A place called Tracks. That was the dance palace. And other neighborhood bars that I went to. Can't remember the names though.
Were most of these gay or LGBT
Gay.
gay bars? Um, What kind of music were you dancing to at the time?
Mm, this I have a problem with. This I have a problem with because I get the ballroom dancing music, which covered everything from country western to swing, Saturday Night Live kind of stuff, because that was the big push back then. Um, I can't really tell you because I've never been like a big music fan. Because because I'm older, I've had like a few. I'm a more like easy listening kind of people, um, and music just never registered on me in the same way. I'm just trying to think of one group or something I was listening to, other than John Travolta.
A lot of would have been the disco.
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 There you go.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's probably a good kind of music to dance to if you're coming from a ballroom background, because
Right.
it's
And a lot of people, to tell you, a lot of people came in after Saturday Night Fever came out to learn just how to disco. And then they found out that there were other dances, so they learned those as well.
Did you ever teach anybody how to disco?
That was part of what you taught them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Foxtrot, waltz, discos in there, all of them.
So you were probably pretty good on the dance floor.
Pretty good. Not the best, not the worst. Um, we had to do a lot of choreography kinds of things. I was pretty good at that. But my students liked me, so it was good in that way. And you carried the expectation that, of course, you know how to dance. It's like, of course. But I was pretty good.
Especially coming into the club, then you've got a lot of practice and training.
Yeah, true. Pretty good at it.
So, what was your outside of the clubs and your work and stuff? Were you active in church or other community organizations?
No, no church, because I had to go so much as a kid. Um, no, not active in very many organizations outside of, you know.
What was your favorite place to dance out of the places you've mentioned? Or
And I think a place called Tracks.
that's the one
Uh,
I've heard of before.
Say again.
That's one I've heard of before. People have mentioned that.
Yeah. Um, because it was right across the street. And for some reason, it was, I don't know why, it was fun. Yeah, but that's the favorite place to dance. Because after work, sometimes we just drive down the tracks and dance. That's when you could do that. You you smoke a little pot, teach your classes, and then go out dancing after that, and then start all over again.
Sounds like a pretty good deal.
Yeah, it's like when you're young, you can bounce back from that,
Hmm.
you know. But that's why I say it was fun,
Hmm.
and you met a lot of interesting people.
What was the crowd like at Tracts?
It was pretty mixed, if I recall, and I don't remember ever feeling other there. And they played good music, so it was a pretty good place to be.
You mentioned being discriminated at some of the clubs. Was there something about the ones that you were discriminated at? Was there, or was it just certain?
It might have been ownership. It might have been the kind of image they wanted to project. Track was like universal. It was like a We Are the World kind of place. And Numbers was a bit more, I think they catered to a different sort of clientele. And I think they wanted to maintain that.
Was it more of a high end or?
Yeah. And it was a whiter club also. And I think some of it had to do with ownership, as I learned later. And I was never quite sure. I just remember sometimes it being hard to get in, you know, as was another club, which is so strange. They had this short black guy, and it was like trying to get in Studio 54. He would either let you in or not. And, he used that to great advantage for his own personal power. I just remember that popped into my mind. It was odd. You know, it takes me back to, how the slave master was hard on the slaves than other people, that kind of thing.
Did you go home a lot? Did you visit home ever?
Florida,
Yeah.
not very much. Not very much at all. Because I kept things so organized while I was in high school that once I left, it was like a relief. And I never really looked back because there's not very much family there. So didn't really have the urge so much.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you say that you didn't actively hide when you were in Florida, but when
About
you
being gay?
about being gay, but you still were you were
Guarded.
guarded,
Private.
right?
Right.
And when you came here, you weren't still a little bit,
Still a
yeah.
little bit private.
Do you think you opened up then as time went on up
Hmm.
here? Yeah.
But private, only a few places private, not for, and not so much out of fear, because if somebody asked me, I would tell them. But I didn't go around coming out as such. I just sort of lived my life. I wasn't afraid of letting anybody know, but I'm just a private person that way. And some of it just common sense. There are places where you don't let people know that you're gay, like work, you know, and those are just common sense kinds of things to me. When you're looking for a job, it's not something that you promote. But if somebody were to ask me, I tell them, you know. And it's a little bit alien to me sometimes that a lot of people that they have so many problems being gay that I'm sometimes surprised. I realize up here that it probably happens and they probably had to endure a lot. But for me, it was like never a big deal, other than a few, incidents here and there. It's like even going to church, I never felt tormented or torn. I just thought of it as a part of the madness that makes up life. And not everything is going to make sense. So you have to find your own set of propositions and values and stick with that and let the world resolve around you. Otherwise, you'll go nuts. Um, I never told my mother I was gay, although I suspect she knew. Um, and I don't, yeah. And in a small town, it's just not the kind of thing you do, you know. And I don't know what would have happened if I had, but I didn't want to test the theory because I looked at what happened to other people and I go, maybe I won't go that way. Because the people who were gay in my small town, they were respected but kind of ostracized. And I was with a small group of friends who were, like college bound and all of that kind of stuff. So it would have provided a different experience, I think.
Was there anyone, as you were growing up, was there anyone that you knew from your hometown that was openly gay?
I think about 4 people.
Were there not written rules, but unwritten rules about things that they could do? You mentioned they were ostracized, but also respected. Uh,
Well, they were respected because they could fight, and they had to do a lot of fighting. And because for some reason they were in with some of the more important people in the town, like worked for them perhaps, or they had some sort of connection. So that offered them a certain sense of protection. But like they wouldn't get invited to stay overnight at one of their friends' house, like I did. Um, because I had like a group of 5 people in my hometown. I was the poorest of the bunch, the darkest of the bunch, because this is back when color mattered. And the only reason that I was a part of that group of people whose parents were professionals is that I was smart, and that was equalizer. So that's what got me in that little clique of sorts.
Did did you bring any of those friends with you when you came to Cleveland, or did they all stay back in Florida?
And they all moved around. Um, yeah, when I came to Cleveland, it was just solo. And they were like, I call them the band of brothers because they were just like the 5 or 6 guys that I grew up with. Um, one's a doctor in Florida, one's an attorney in Tampa, one's a teacher in Tallahassee, another worked for the CDC, that kind of thing.
So you've stayed in somewhat contact with them.
With a few of them, with about 3 of them, I stayed in contact. Because I just went to my 5th class reunion a little while ago, which was another bizarre occurrence. The first one I went to, I was the only black person there. In my school, I guess it might have been 300 seniors or so. And it didn't feel odd at all, because I was so used to it. And I was pretty involved in high school. And although there were a lot of bad things going around me, there was something about the small town that insulated me and others, that same group of people, for some reason. So we didn't have the same kind of bad things that happened to us that happened to people in the South and other surrounding areas. So that was a good thing. I forgot what the other part, the question you were asking about.
I think I might have forgotten it as well. You've stayed in contact with them.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
And most of them turned out okay. Yeah, there's 5 or 6 people that I was part of that group. Um, and when I talk about a community raising, the community sort of raised me because my mother was always working. So there were other people that I could count on, and I just didn't feel the urge to be like a hellraiser, anything like that, because I was so focused um, on getting out of there. Not that it was bad, I just knew that I wanted more. That's all.
And Cleveland was something new and different.
Something new. And yeah, just something new. And I like dancing, and I like music. And it offered both. I just happened to move in the worst winter that they've had in a decade. The other thing about college that I really made a big deal was being able to travel. Because once you go out of the country, it changes your worldview about what's possible. So that's another thing that made a big difference growing up. I don't travel as much now because it's harder. Things are more of a, when you're young, you're just brave and you're kind of fearless. But now I'm like risk averse.
Well, we've had a lot of new and risks in the last 2 decades, I think, to navigate that I think the United States hasn't had to so much in the past. So you were working in the adult bookstore, and this is probably the mid '80s or so.
Yeah, about the mid 80s.
How long did you work there?
Let's see, long enough to pay off my student loan, about 3 years.
And where did you go after that?
After that, I went back to school.
And that's when you went for what did you go to school for?
English literature.
English literature. And what job did that lead you to
After literature,
after your school? Yeah.
Cleveland State and the community college here.
Okay.
I started teaching there.
Hmm.
Eventually got tenure, retired last year.
So you've taught for quite a few years.
24 years I taught at the community college and 2 or 3 years at Cleveland State.
How did you? How did that work for you? Is that something you really enjoyed?
Loved it. I loved teaching, and the population I was teaching, adults, was fun. Um, oh yeah, it didn't really feel like a job. It felt more like just hanging out with people and talking about stuff. Um, yeah, I did that for 24 years. And when it comes to things that I really enjoyed, that would be one of them. And that's what I mean. When I was growing up, I always liked teaching people stuff, but I never thought of teaching as a profession as such. For some reason, I never made that connection. It's just something that you did.
What kind of literature did you appreciate most?
For a long time, it was British literature, then I moved into African American literature. And to tell you the truth, I don't really like to read. I like to read what I like, but I'm not one of these people that just sits around reading all the time. I just like to read what I like to read. I just read the other stuff because I have to tell you the truth about it, although I don't admit it.
What kind of stuff did you pull out in your class to teach?
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, as you're teaching literature, you're able as the teacher to make the choices. So, were there things that you decided to pull out, books to choose, or?
Well, like Cleveland State, it was mostly British literature. They were heavy on Shakespeare and American literature. So there are people like, everyone from Tennessee Williams to Lady Words of Color Purple. I can't remember her name. That was at Cleveland State. But at the community college, I was teaching students who were underprepared. So it was a lot of developmental kinds of things. So it was just introducing people to the language again. And those books, they were pretty prescribed. But one of the things I wanted to do was just to expose them to things that they might have never seen before, which echoes back to something that happened to me when I was in the third grade. My teacher took us to the Smithsonian, and it changed my world. So I'm thinking if a situation like that could change my outlook, then if I exposed other students to those kinds of things, it would open up their world. Because a lot of students I noticed, particularly the students, our population, their world was pretty small. And they might have never left town. They might have never, left the country. So as much as I could, I just wanted to let them know that there's a big world out there with lots of things and it's bigger than you are. So not to sell yourself short was my message that was overriding everything, And I think that's why I enjoyed doing it so much. Plus they were fun because they were adults and I could say outrageous things that I could never say with other people. And we could talk about anything. And I was constantly getting in trouble for, being inappropriate. But I welcomed that. That's when I knew I was doing it right, Because I had a lot of teachers, they did it just by the book. And I found them boring and kind of cowardly. But that's just because I was doing it the opposite way. I wanted to justify how I was doing it because I think it was a better way. Because you have to meet students where they are. And the truth of the matter is, I think that a lot of my colleagues, they wanted to be at Harvard and Princeton and teaching a bunch of black kids who were a little rough around the edges was not their cup of tea, you know. I think that was part of it, you know.
Were you able to bring some of your? How do you feel like your experiences growing up in the South may have prepared you for life? Um, or maybe not specifically in the South, but just growing up. What are the things that you think were valuable?
I know what it feels like to be loved. Um, ooh, this is a big one. I know what it feels like to be validated. And I think that makes a big difference that I'm thinking about it. And I think a lot of people suffer from the lack of that, which causes them so much angst. It's like as growing up, because I was smart, there were lots of successes. And there were successes through college and successes after that. So I never really felt the need to be validated by other people in the same way. You know, you want to be recognized, sure, but there was not that overwhelming, unhealthy desire to be validated in that particular way. And I tell my students, and I tell my friends, it always seemed a little bit odd, but I understood it. Like people would put up with a lot of abuse from family and friends. And I've always thought that unless you're in my corner, family or not, then you're just like a stranger on the street. And maybe because I'm an only child, I don't make those distinctions about familial ties in the same way. You know, somebody I look at it differently. And the one thing that I've had to maintain and remember that not everybody thinks like I do. And it took me a while to understand that because I was operating under that assumption and it didn't always serve me well. Like when it comes to honesty and things like that, um, you think that everybody has the same kind of value system. So it's a little bit disappointing when you find out that not everybody does. So I had to make that adjustment because I was always idealistic and a little bit romantic. But over the years, I've had to have a more of a guarded optimism. You know, I still do the same things, but just not in the same way. That seems to work out.
So is there so this is focusing on the LGBTQ community in Cleveland. Are there things I haven't asked about that you would, organizations, groups, social norms that I
I'm not really tied in so much anymore. It's like when I first started hearing about the LGBT community, I had to stop and think about it because there were so many letters I used to get confused. And again, I think it's just part of being, I think it's part of being older. I think if I was in my 30s or 40s, I'd be all into it. But now that I'm older, it's a different set of priorities. You know, I follow and I think about, but as far as being actively involved, not so much these days.
um as we grow older, we move on, we change. When do you think you left the club scene behind?
Let's see, 16. I think anywhere between my 20s and 30s. I'm thinking, but I've always had a problem with years and dates and things like that. But it was so much of a gradual thing, I didn't really notice. I know it's when I started teaching for sure.
So you
because I was
probably
studying so much. I
right.
think around then.
So you're probably still in the club scene into the early '90s.
Right.
Yeah. Did you notice a change in the gay community from the time you arrived here in the early '80s to maybe the early '90s, or even larger over time that you've noticed all the time you've been here?
Well, whatever I've noticed, it had to have been from a distance. I noticed that it's not nearly as much fun. And I haven't been out in so long. It seems when I was growing up in Grayson, it was vibrant. There was a lot going on, and I felt safer in that respect. You could take more risk in terms of meeting people, and we had characters as opposed to just people. So it was like constantly entertaining the gay scene back then. And over the years, it seems to have been diluted. And you know, to go to a gay bar now, I wouldn't know what to think about it. And I think that I don't know how to put this, but it's like now everybody's coming out, so it loses a little bit of the luster. And there was just a little bit of intrigue back in the '90s. A little bit of cloak and dagger. That was kind of interesting to me back then. And now it seems to me, at least, kind of dull.
I've heard that before, that before coming out was so
Common,
common, accepted,
except yeah,
um, that there was a bit more of a performance element. I've heard people talk about characters before. Can you think of any specific characters or types of characters that you would
personally
see?
that I knew.
Yeah.
God, there's my boss. There was a guy that we used to call Russell, because Russell, first of all, he was the funniest guy in the world, but he had any kind of drug that you would need. You had guys that would walk into a bar and just do backflips all down the bar. You had oh, people who were great dancers, and there were people who had reputations for one thing or another. Um, Female impersonators. It's like you were able to see them in and out of their personas, which was interesting to me. Um, you knew what people's reputations were for the kind of people that you liked and were attracted to. There was a bit more intimacy in a way that's hard to explain. But I'm surprised to hear other people mention that about characters as well. It's been an interesting journey down memory lane. Sex on a Train is good. Sex Abroad is good.
Where did you go abroad to?
London. I think I had my first official oral sex in London, and it's still embarrassing now, but it was the boys I drunk last night. Such a cliche. Um, Lots of regrets about people that I didn't pursue. The opportunity was there, but I was a coward. In case you're wrong, it could be really embarrassing. Um, in Italy, had an unhealthy, not unhealthy, but a relationship with a guy who turned out to be a priest in the catacombs of San Sebastiano. Little things like that. It's been an interesting little ride now that I think about it, you know. There have certainly been more good times than bad times, although there have been some doozies.